So hi, welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where I'll talk each week about one thing I've learned for each of the 50 years I've lived. Today is exciting because it's the first real episode. Last week we did kind of an intro, but now we're kicking it all off in earnest with thing number 1. And then the plan is to count our way up over the course of the next year. Last week I mentioned that this list started out as just 50 random things in no particular order. But as I considered them and edited them, I realized that they all fell pretty organically into 10 discrete categories. Thing number 1 is from what I'm calling the making category. And in some ways, when I talk about creativity or I reference making stuff, I'm probably mostly referring to writing and language just by default, because that happens to be my personal thing. But I hope that most of the things that fall into my making category are actually going to be pertinent to a lot of other kinds of endeavors too, like painting or building things or baking a wedding cake or maybe even starting a business. Whatever it is you're making stuff can be really hard. And of course, this is because the actual work of making is often really challenging. It's tiring, it's time-consuming. I find it infuriatingly iterative. But making is also hard because there's a lot of psychological and emotional hullabaloo that goes into even deciding that you should, or that you're able, or that you are even allowed to make stuff. At least there is for me. And I think it's true for a lot of us. There can just be sort of an element of how dare you, or who do you think you are, that sometimes gets attached to the act of making. I have always found it strangely scary and embarrassing to say, hey, I want to make this thing. Or even worse, hey, look at this thing I just made. Ugh. But I have also learned over the years that if I feel called to make something, it's almost always good for me to do it. Whether that thing succeeds or fails or is acclaimed or gets critiqued or whatever. That urge to just make, it's the only reason that something like this 50/50 project would exist. I mean, who wants this thing from me? No one. How many people asked for it? About 0. But there's something in me that just wants to make it. And I think that's license enough. So here we all are. Okay, down to business. Thing number 1. Get good at being bad at stuff. God, this is so hard for so many of us, I think. For me, the process often goes like this. I think to myself, wow, I'd really like to do this new thing. And I daydream about it, and I observe people who are already doing it really well, and maybe I invest in gear or supplies or training, and then I give it a go, and I'm really, really bad at it. I mean, of course I am. I've just entered the first part of what is probably a pretty tough, pretty lengthy learning process. And logically, I know that I'm going to have to be bad at something long enough to get good at it. There's just no way around that. But emotionally, it can be so disappointing and off-putting. It stings and it humbles. I really like what Ira Glass has had to say about all of this. By the way, most of the 50 ideas that I'm going to talk about this year are not even mine. Most of the good ones will end up being stolen from far smarter people, like Ira Glass. He's an NPR commentator. He's the longtime host of a program called This American Life. And he has talked about this space in the creative process that he calls the gap. And the gap is this gulf that exists between our ambitious, audacious vision of the thing that we want to create, the thing that exists as a perfect specimen in our imagination, this thing that we really want to bring into being, and the rickety, iffy, messy execution of the beginner. A beginner who inevitably knows what they want to make, but doesn't yet know the process or the craft or the technicalities of how to do it. The gap is only natural. It's unavoidable, it's going to be there. And he argues that it's actually evidence of your own good taste because you're aware of the wiggle room between great work and what you've so far been able to create. But it's also a disappointing and painful place to be sometimes. And if you're anything like me, you can get stuck in that space. That space is where frustration lives and self-doubt. It's where humiliation and self-consciousness can hang out. It's where we get sad or tired or embarrassed enough to just quit. And as Ira Glass points out, that's a shame because you have to go through that gap to get to the next execution, which may be better. It's really the only route to building skills and eventually to building the mastery that will get you to your execution as you originally conceived it. Personally, I think as I age, I'm entering a really crucial time in terms of my relationship with the gap. I think this is a uniquely midlife lesson that you have to relearn at this age. And here's why. When you're a kid and you're in school, and then maybe college, and then maybe getting started in a job as some kind of junior associate of whatever kind, you spend a lot of time in a learning posture just by default. And maybe you have a little more tolerance for sitting in this long, loopy gap and just learning. But later, when you get to be 35 or 45 or 50, and you're out of school, and you've become the adult in the room or the parent in the relationship, and you're supposed to know what you're doing, I wonder if your tolerance for that gap shrinks. You want a shorter, straighter arrow, usually to a destination you've been to countless times before. I think this has been true for me, and I think it's important for me to force myself to sustain a tolerance for the gap, to keep learning, and to keep doing new things, even if I have to do them really badly at first. And again, this project is an example of that. I wanted to make a thing, and I wanted it really to be a podcast. I don't know how to do that yet. There's a technical and a technological bar to get over there. So I'm starting here. Do people who know what they're doing podcast using PowerPoint? No, I don't think they do. Are they drawing their slides by hand with felt tip markers? Again, no, I'm pretty sure they're not. But this is what I'm working with at the moment. And this won't turn out to be great at first, but maybe each successive installment will get a little bit better as we go. But you know what? It's okay too if they don't. Ira Glass, I think, is right that we have to persevere at being bad before we can ever triumph at being good. But I also think there's a lot to be gained, even if we can't ever quite manage to close that gap completely. And sometimes the reward is just in doing the thing, good, bad, ugly, or otherwise. Take a look at these cats, for example. I doodled them the other day after seeing a tutorial online in which an artist wrote out the word cat on a piece of paper and then drew in cat bodies around the letter forms. I was really enchanted by that, so I spent a good 20 minutes just doodling cats. They're strange, they're random, and because I personally have very little aptitude in drawing, they're not going to lead to markedly better cats. They're not going to open the door to an eventual career as an Instagram cat doodler or something. But it was fun to do for a little while, even though I was kind of bad at it. And I think it's good to make bad stuff if you're enjoying the process. So I think there's a lot to be gained by getting good at being bad at stuff, whether it's the immediate gratification of just enjoying something you're never going to be great at, or if it's the satisfaction of gradual improvement in something that you do want to improve at over time, or the joy of eventual mastery of actually getting all the way through that gap and meeting your vision at long last. Okay, so I talk a pretty good game here, but what's my execution score on getting good at being bad at stuff? I'll give myself about a 6 out of 10 here. I still struggle with getting stuck in that in-between space and giving up. I still get discouraged and disappointed and tired of my own clumsiness and impatient with my own amateurism. But I do think that as I've gotten older, I better understand the importance of pushing myself into new experiences and coaxing these old bones of mine into new learning postures from time to time. And I'm going to try to keep getting better at it as I go. Try to let go of more of the ego or the timidity or whatever it is that tells me I shouldn't be caught dead doing or making anything that I'm not already great at doing or making. Because that's no way to live. And it's certainly no way to grow or to get better with age or to be the lifelong learner that I always claim I want to be. All of this makes me think of a couple quotes that tie in here. One is this: I am always doing that which I cannot do in order that I may learn how to do it. I've heard this one attributed to Picasso, and in at least one other case, Voltaire. And the scant amount of Googling that I was willing to do to determine its true provenance was inconclusive, so I'll just be a terrible scholar and skip all attributions. The point is, somebody said this, and it makes a lot of sense to me. The power of the phrase is its own self-evidence. I mean, how else does one learn but by doing? But I think to see it distilled so eloquently is helpful. The other one is, what would you do if you knew you could not fail? And I've heard this one credited to Eleanor Roosevelt, but wherever it came from, it has since been adopted by every manner of self-help advisor and author. But it's such a useful thought prompt. It helps us think about what we really want to do or make or be, and it helps us weigh in more concrete terms what we want against our fears of the gap that Ira Glass talks about. If we take that gap out of the equation, what would we do? If we could fast forward through the sometimes painful process that unfolds in that space, where might we choose to go? But we can't. So I wonder if it's useful to also consider a parallel question. What is still worth doing, even though you know you will fail? What's worth it? If you know it's literally the only path to learning anything new, like podcasting, or enjoying anything that doesn't fall effortlessly within your natural wheelhouse, like drawing cats. I mean, what doors might open to us if we somehow really learned to make friends with failure? I don't know the answer to this because I haven't been able to do it completely successfully. I may never get there all the way. It's the kind of goal that really goes against human nature. But I think it's worth thinking about, at least for me, and especially at this time in my life, when I'm getting less and less used to being in a learning stance. But I think it's probably tough for everybody, since we seem to live in a world where the representation and fixation of and on perfection is everywhere. Today is an especially good day to think about all of this, maybe. In a few hours, I'll join perhaps millions of people in going outside and looking up at the skies in the hopes of seeing a total solar eclipse. And the magic of that moment will be in the improbable, extraordinary perfection of the alignment between the moon and the earth and the sun, arrayed in just such a way that something so huge and so bright can be completely blocked out by something comparatively minuscule, right over the swath of ground on which we'll all be standing and watching. There's undeniable wonder in perfection like that, an invitation to marvel at the clockwork precision of our universe, whether you see that as fluke or design. But I think it's worth remembering that really, every time the moon moves around the earth and the earth around the sun, that's an occasion of wonder too, even if the shadows don't fall in such dramatic and perfect fashion. Blah, blah, blah. That's enough out of me for today. If you're headed out to watch the eclipse, I wish you clear skies. And if you're going into that gap to take on some exciting, challenging new endeavor, well, I wish you luck there too, at getting good at being bad at stuff. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll be back next week with thing 2 already of 50.